We are looking at Ghazali's description of al-Kalam in his book Al-Mustasfa, and last time we looked at his distinction between contingent and necessary and the type of, and then we looked at the necessary being, and we found that with necessary being al-Mutakallim finds that necessary being which Mutakallim studies necessary being as to its being and its action, and finds that with its being there are certain things which are possible, certain things which are impossible, like incompatible with its nature. There are certain things which are necessary, that is part of its nature. Similarly, its action are divided into possible, impossible, and necessary. So there are actions which are compatible with its nature, so they are possible. There are actions which are incompatible with its nature, those are impossible. And there are action which is part of its nature, so they are necessary for such a being. And then from there the Mutakallim sees that the world is possible and and it exists. And humans are possible, and they exist, and human beings need guidance in their life, and it's possible that God sends, and that guidance, they have the sources of reason, but there are certain things like which reason can't access, that then they need some guide, and God, it's possible that God sends that guide. And then God has actually sent a prophet, and the truth of that prophet is explained by the Mutakallim based on his miracles. So that's where we stopped last time. And here he is sort of a bombshell, in the sense that he basically, based on his conception of Kalam, he puts limits on reason and its capacity. And there he says that in the Haza, once he has proven the truth of the prophet, that is the prophet from God, then this finishes the job of a Mutakallim. In the Hadha yanqati'u kalam al-Mutakallim. And not just it finishes the job of the Mutakallim, but it also finishes the job of the reason. وَيَنْتَهِي تَصَرُّفُ الْعَقْلِ. So he puts limits on reason here based on the completion of the work of Mutakallim. Because بَلِ الْعَقْلُ يَدُلُّ عَلَى صِدْقِ النَّبِي ثُمَّ يَعْزِلُ نَفْسَهُ وَيَعْتَرِفُ بِأَنَّهُ يتلقى من النبي بالقبول ما يقوله في الله واليوم الآخر مما لا يستقل العقل بدركه ولا يقضي أيضا باستحالته. So that's very so we have to go slowly on there. So what happens is, once the Mutakallim has established the truth of the Prophet, then his job is finished. Mutakallim. And the job of reason is also finished. And now the reason and Mutakallim both follow the Prophet once they know that the Prophet is true prophet from God. So they follow him. So that finishes so this put limits on reason, but not limits on reason as such, because you still need reason to understand what the Prophet is saying, but limits the realm of reason in metaphysical realm, because although the reason was able to get into a study of what exists and from there divide existence into possible and necessary, and from there establishes the truth of the Prophet, it doesn't, or it cannot on its own cannot on its own know anything further about those realms. So there are two things here. Firstly, what we are denying is the reason, not the use of reason as such, but its self-sufficiency. And what are we denying? Reason is not in all realms. So not all the use of reason, just its self-sufficiency, that it's on its own without any external help, it can't. And not in the normal realm in which reason can get knowledge or gather knowledge or access knowledge on its own, but in those realms that would be metaphysical and some of the ethical realms, as we will see. So that's what he's saying, that once the truth of the prophethood is established, prophet or the messenger, Kalam is stopped, reason is stopped as to its self-sufficiency in the realm in which reason doesn't have any knowledge. Otherwise we wouldn't need prophet in the first place, because if reason could discover truth in all the areas we need, then we wouldn't need a prophet. So let's see. So let's go back and have a look. So in the Hada Yankata Kalam al-Mutakallim, so once the Mutakallim establishes the truth of the Prophet, his work finishes, and وَيَنْتَهِ تَصَرُّفُ الْعَقْلِ, and reason's work is also finished. بل العقل يدل على صدق النبي ثم يعزل نفسه يعزل نفسه ويعترف بأنه يلتقي أو بأنه يتلقى من النبي بالقبول ما يقوله في الله واليوم الآخر مما لا يستقل العقل بدركه ولا يقضي أحد باستحالته. So once the prophets establish the work of the Kalima reason is finished, and reason set itself aside and it accepts, reason accepts what the Prophet says about God, the nature of God. So reason actually establishes that there is God and there are certain things which are possible for God, impossible, etc. But more than that, it can't tell us anything about God. So life after death, reason can't tell us. So it knows that reason knows that it can't know those things on its own. So it accepts what the Prophet says about those things. So the Prophet comes with knowledge which reason doesn't have access to on its own. That's the thing. As for example, the attributes of God, his nature and life after death, for example. But those things which Prophet tells us, they are not they can't be impossible, because then we would have to attribute impossibility to the necessary being, which is against its nature. So what the Prophet says are not impossible. They are not against the reason, but they are beyond the capacity of reason. So the reason accepts what the Prophet says, because and this acceptance is rational in the sense that it has already established that the Prophet is the true Prophet and the Prophet is from God. Okay, so بالقبول ما يقول في الله واليوم ما لا يستقل العقل بدركه ولا يقضي أيضا باستحالته. So now he is explaining this a bit more. فلا يرد الشرع بما يخالف العقل لكن يرد بما يقصر العقل عن الاستقلال بإدراكه. So that's very important. It's basically sort of elaboration on what we have already said, but what he says that Fala Yaridu Sharu, so the Islamic teachings don't, or the teaching of a prophet, that's what Shara is, teachings of the prophets, can't be against the reason. Meaning, فلا يرد الشرع بما يخالف العقل. By against the reason means something which is like 2 plus 2, 5, or anything which involves obvious contradiction, for example, or anything which is against facts, for example, empirical facts. So the Prophet doesn't come anything which is against reason, because that will attribute impossibility to the necessary being. But it can come with things, and it does come with things, otherwise there's no reason for the Prophet to come, which reason, لكن يرد بما يكسر العقل عن الاستقلال بإدراكه، ولكن فلا يرد الشرع بما يخالف العقل لكن يرد بما يكسر العقل عن الاستقلال بإدراكه. But it does come, the Prophet does come with teachings which reason is unable to understand or access or know on its own. So what is Ghazali limiting here is, through his description of Kalam, is reason, self-sufficiency, in certain forms of knowledge. And until now he has mentioned specifically two types of knowledge: detailed knowledge of the God, although reason can and does know some general characteristics about God, because on the basis of those it has established the truth of the Prophet, but it doesn't know and can't know on its own the detail about the nature of God. And number two, it doesn't know anything about life after death. So anything which is, metaphysics in that sense. So its self-sufficiency in that realm is denied. But none of that knowledge can be against the reason, in the sense that Prophet doesn't come with something which contradicts the basic principle of reasons, like possibility or impossibility or contradiction and things like that. Okay. And إذ العقل قد لا يستقل بإدراك كون الطاعة سببا لسعادة الآخر وكون المعاصي سببا للشقاوة لكنه لا يقضي باستحالته أيضا. So here is the third example he gave. So first example was the detailed knowledge of God, which reason can't know on its own, and life after death, which reason can't know, but reason also doesn't judge that these things are impossible. Okay, the third example he gave is, for example, and that's about more about ethical realm. So reason on its own can't tell us whether obedience to the dictates of what the Prophet comes with leads to salvation. So reason can't know on its own that those teachings will lead to salvation. Now it knows because it knows that the Prophet is from God. But before the Prophet, it couldn't tell us what will lead to salvation. What is the way to salvation? Similarly, reason cannot know that, going against the teaching with the Prophet come with would lead to what's the opposite of salvation? Damnation. Shaqawa. And salvation is Saada. So before the coming of the Prophet, the reason doesn't know and cannot know on its own what's the way to salvation for human beings and what's the way to the damnation and things like that. But reason also doesn't say that what the Prophet has come up with is impossible. So 3 examples he has now given where reason can't know things on its own. One is the nature of God, the other is life after death, and the third is which way of life is lead to salvation and which way of life would lead to damnation. So reason on its own can't tell us about these things, and the Prophet come up with these things, and reason accept that based on that the Prophet is the true Prophet, and because these things are possible and not impossible. So لكنه لا يقضي باستهالة ويقضي بوجوب صدق من دلت المعجزة على صدقه فإذا أخبر الرسول عنه صدق العقل به بهذا الطريق هذا ما يهويه علم الكلام. So reason don't know these things on its own, but reason does know that the Prophet who has come with miracles is the true Prophet, and that's why we have to accept what he brings, and what he brings is can be something which reason cannot discover on its own, but once he comes with it, reason realizes that it is something possible and something rational and not something which is impossible. So that's why. So al-Kalam, the purpose of al-Kalam is based on reason, establish the truth of the Prophet orderly. That's his ultimate thing. And to tell us once Prophet has come, we should follow the Prophet. And why? And once he has done that, its thing is finished, its function is finished. فإذا أخبر الرسول أن صدق العقل بهذا الطريق فهذا ما يحويه علم. So this is what علم فقد عرفت من هذا, and now he is just sort of summarizing what he has said. أنه يبتدي نظره علم الكلام, start with the most general thing, and that's the existent, and then step by step it comes to the detail of different types of beings, and then through that it basically prove the fundamentals of all other religious. So it provides the foundation of all the religious discipline, because all the religious disciplines presuppose that the Prophet is a true Prophet. They presuppose it, but they can't show it on a rational basis. So that's what al-Kalam does. And once it is done, then it leaves, the detail after that to the specific Islamic sciences. So I think that finishes Ghazali's description of the functional. It's a sort of functionalist definition or operational definition. So the function of al-Kalam and how it is related to other Islamic disciplines. And in the next video, I'll just give my general comments on this.